It's amazing to think that it was, 7 years ago that we wrote Embracing Change. And then, of course, a couple of years later, we did the follow-up. But an awful lot has changed in those 7 years. And yet, on the other hand, some things have not changed at all. And I think the idea of the conversations that we're about to have is to just reflect back on what we wrote, to highlight the things that haven't changed but are still incredibly important, but to perhaps discuss the ways in which some things have altered, how they've altered, and what that means for religious congregations.
I think that's right, and I think certainly the whole point originally of Embracing Change was to consolidate the guidance and information that people had given up to that point in time. And it's been interesting to see people and how they reacted to it and how they've developed going forward. But obviously I think the last 18 months have very much demonstrated a sort of accelerated change.
Yes.
And it's about now looking forward again and thinking, looking back, how have things changed? How do we take that forward into the next evolution and phase?
I think so. And I think, we can split the conversations, I think, into sort of 3 or 4 different areas. But for me, trusteeship, I think, is one of the key things that congregations need to be thinking about in the next few years. How they appoint trustees to their congregation, what the roles of those trustees are, the role of lay people or mission partners, but also some of the key decisions that they're going to have to make, particularly in terms of property strategy, what they do with their money, how they fund and finance the care of their own older members and so on, and ultimately what their legacy is. So if they retain assets, do they want to move towards being a grant-making charity, or do they want to allow the wider congregation to have the money and gradually send that money overseas?
And I think there's also been some very interesting developments with congregations not just focusing on legacy and in sometimes thinking, actually, is there another phase of delivering the mission, perhaps not necessarily alongside a way of life, and actually looking at different structures and innovations on that side?
I think so, and I think the danger is, and I suppose everybody does this as they get older, and you start to think, well, actually, there's very little opportunity, but I still think there's massive opportunity for congregations to have a real input into the way that people live and the work that people do. A lot of them have got resources. They could do grant-making work now, and that enables them. In the past, the people have done the work. Now, some of the congregations are in that position where their resources can do the work and do the talking. But that is so exciting because it just means that they're involved, but in a very different way. And, there are many opportunities out there. So it's been really good, hasn't it, to be back in the APB, actually physically seeing people rather than looking at them through a computer screen.
Yes, I think it makes a complete difference, doesn't it, having a 3D person to engage with as opposed to a 2D person on the screen. But obviously it's been very interesting reflecting back, being here, as to some of the things we've done with the APB in recent years.
Yeah.
And obviously thinking back to Embracing Change that we wrote in 2014, and the whole idea when we did that of thinking about helping religious look at the future and starting to think about the changes. And I think certainly over the last 18 months, there's been a good opportunity to reflect back on a lot of the material that was in Embracing Change and Consecrated Journey, and think about how things are moving forward and whether there's been particular changes over the last few months.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about whether there have been changes in terms of the way things are done, but also to reflect back on, people's lives have changed, and people, I think, have realised now that they can do things in different ways. And I think it's important to just think, going forward, do we try to revert back to what we were pre-COVID, or do we try and take the best of both and adapt and live differently going forward?
Yes, and I think one of the big issues in a lot of this is obviously the role of the trustee.
Absolutely.
And whether that's something that has changed over the last 18 months, or whether it's something that was already changing and evolving into a different type of role and could be different going forward.
I think it's probably a mix of the two, because I think pre-COVID, I think many congregations were beginning to realise that the role of trustee, as they saw it, was taking up an increasing amount of their time, was becoming more onerous. And I think post-COVID, having reflected on how they've adapted to that role over the last 18 months, it's a classic example really of the need now to think about, well, trusteeship, does it continue as it was? Or do we need to define what we need to do as trustees? But is there a different role, a management role? And if there is, who does that management role? Do we continue to do it? Or do we bring in lay people or other people to help us in that journey going forward?
And I think traditionally there's been sort of very much that role, hasn't there? The trustee has been a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week role. And I think stepping back from it, obviously when smaller charities tend to get set up, it tends to be quite common, doesn't it, for the trustees to be doing everything and doing all of those roles. And I think in the charities run by religious orders, it's been very natural for them to want to be doing all of the work and all of the activities, and actually not necessarily stepping back and saying, well, what's trusteeship and what's management?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things to reflect on over the next few months, really, in terms of there's 3 different roles, isn't there? There's the trustee role, there's the management and administrative role of actually running the charity, but then there's also the canonical role of looking after the members, the pastoral role, and I think it's defining each of those. And I think if that's done carefully, it is possible to separate certainly the management and administrative one out and think about, well, do we start to bring in other people who can fulfil those tasks, who can help us?
And do you think we're starting to see a greater acceptance of this idea that perhaps trusteeship and implementation of trustees' decisions and management can be more separated out?
I think we are. I think there is a growing awareness that something needs to change going forward. And I think most provincial leaderships are coming round to the fact that that's probably the thing that needs to alter. I think it's a matter of having confidence, isn't it? And bringing in people who you can trust, but also accept that those people hopefully are going to be competent at the role. But part of that role is also knowing that the certain information is going to be confidential, they're not going to go out and talk about it, and actually making sure that there is a clear delegation of authority and that people you bring in know the limit of their authority and don't try to take over. And I think, the congregation, the leadership of the congregation needs to understand and appreciate that they're always going to be the people in charge. And part of the role of being a trustee is that strategic direction, that vision, the thought of where do we want to go. And it's the management that then actually implement that and carrying it out on an operational level.
I think for me, I've always seen that there's been sort of reticence because there was this feeling that by actually delegating to management, it was handing over responsibility. But I would very much see it as actually asking a helping hand to help you do the work. And
yeah, I think it can free you up, and I think it can allow you that freedom of thought so that you can spend more time thinking about where do we want to go, what do we want to do, how do we want to do it, and more time to actually spend with other members of the community.
And I think it's interesting because obviously with a lot of the other charities that we work with that aren't connected with religious orders, you tend to find that the trustees turn up 5 or 6 times a year, maybe an away day, and it's a very different role, isn't it? And you can see people doing it at a much more advanced age and saying, actually, it's not that huge burden that I think it is.
I think so. If I sort of reflect back on the charity that I'm a trustee of, we do meet 4 times a year. There are subcommittees in between. But yes, and I don't ever feel that somehow as a trustee I'm not fulfilling my responsibilities. So it can be done. I think it's a matter of doing it gently and introducing it and becoming confident with that new way of working.
And I think there's also that tension, isn't there, as you mentioned earlier, about the congregational side and the care of the members. And I think, again, it's that slight understanding, as you said, of the separation between trusteeship, management, and the life of the congregation.
Yeah.
And realising that the charity is there to support and make assets available for use by the congregation, but that the trustees don't necessarily need to engage themselves in that sort of congregational life. And that's more a matter for leadership of the congregation as opposed to the trustee role.
Yeah, and it's about having boundaries, isn't it? Because I think it is important that the lay people, whether you call them mission partners, whatever you call them, but their role is to actually administer and manage the charity. They don't have a right to interfere in the lives of individual members, and their lives should be allowed to carry on in the same way as they always have done. But possibly, if you can free up the leadership with more support and more pastoral help.
And do you think in the last 18 months we've seen rapid change in the way that trustees have to operate as trustees?
I think what we've seen is probably a need to make decisions a lot more quickly than perhaps in religious congregations they've traditionally been made. The last 18 months, particularly the first few months, everything moved so quickly. I think, to be honest, we all thought when we went into that first lockdown that, 3 or 4 weeks later, we'd all be out of it and life would be back to normal. It didn't work out that way. And I think the longer it went on, the more people realised that we had to adapt. And I think that was different for religious congregations. I think traditionally, one of the things that I've always found really interesting is the way in which congregations, the leadership is changed. Every 4 or 5 years you have a chapter, you have a new mandate, you often have a complete change in leadership. There are advantages of that, but one of the big disadvantages I've always felt is that, new leadership, 1 year to actually get to know what the job is, 2-3 years of doing the job, and then a year of actually saying, well, we'll leave it till the next team. And I think one of the problems with that is it's tended to mean that decision making has been more prolonged, more protracted, more prolonged. And I think that changed during the last 18 months because people realised that regardless of where they were in their mandate, some key decisions had to be made. And it's one of the things I think that I would like to see continue. Decisions need to be thought through, but they do need to be taken. And I think that's particularly important given the age profile of many of these congregations and some of the discernment that they're going to have to undertake in the next few years.
I think it was interesting, wasn't it, for the congregations that were due to have their chapters and change their leadership and then discovered that they couldn't change their leadership. And you have those trustees who are perhaps imposed thinking, this is the final year, this is when we don't make the drastic decisions, actually then being forced to make those decisions and actually quite often making them really quickly, which I think was difficult. And I think it also possibly showed that there were some skill sets that might have been missing from the trustee boards. And actually, again, that's that question, isn't it? How can you bring in other skills? Do you need to have that wider base of trustees? Or if you've got more management that you can be delegating to and getting the skills coming in through other people?
I think so. And I think when you're talking about mission partners, you really need to be looking at people with the skills that will help you in your day-to-day work rather than people who are going to help you make decisions. I think the decisions still need to be made by the congregation, but it's actually facilitating the work and it's looking at those skills and the types of personality that you need, because it's going to be difficult for the first little while just bringing in mission partners, particularly if they've never been used before, because everybody will be finding their feet, knowing what roles everybody does, making sure people are not seen to be treading on one another's toes and so on.
And I think the other thing I found interesting was obviously quite often you have the trustees living together in community. And I think it was interesting seeing that they had to sometimes split out in different ways. Some of them were in other countries and couldn't get back here. And learning to actually work in a way where they weren't all physically present together, I think had an interest in how they made decisions. And
I think so, and I think that sort of brings us on to the whole aspect of virtual meetings, which is new for everybody, but I think it was particularly new for religious congregations. And I think, you know, there've been advantages and disadvantages of using Zoom or Teams and things like that. But I think one of the key things has been that sort of watching people's body language, and you've seen people for 18 months in 2 dimensions, as opposed to looking at them from a 3-dimensional point of view. And I think that's what's so nice about being able to be back face to face with people, because you do pick up things from body language and so on. And that's one of the important things about trusteeship, I think. And so, you know, I would hope that it wouldn't continue just being virtual meetings. I think there is a place for virtual meetings, but I think you do need those face-to-face meetings as well.
I think it's been very interesting because there was a lot of talk about people being much more connected, but I certainly felt that yes, I was connected with a lot more people, but there was no connectivity because I couldn't really see them and understand how they were thinking, and it's just this 2-dimensional view, isn't it? And I think for me, I kept thinking of that old phrase about if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? And I started to think with Zoom meetings that, you know, if I turn the screen off, is this meeting actually taking place, or is it just me participating with the screen? And certainly what I've noticed is, again, a lot of the religious order charities rely on making decisions by consensus. And I think that's much harder to do when you're doing it in this 2-dimensional world, and you can't pick up on body language, and you can't have those sort of round the edges conversations that you would normally have.
Definitely. I think because often meetings are very long, and I think that break, that natural break in the middle of a meeting where you all get up, you have coffee, the conversation continues, but it continues in a very different way. And it's often in those conversations that you pick up nuances or you pick up ideas that enable you to come back round the table, and that decision can be made with that consensus, as you say. I think that's incredibly important.
And have you seen online meetings working well? Because I mean, certainly for me, I've tended to feel that the conversation has become very much a discussion by rotation, and you put your hand up and you end up going down lots of blind alleys, and then you go back to the person who had their hand up fifth, and they're trying to argue the first point rather than the later point.
I think if you're going to have a virtual meeting or even a hybrid meeting, you need a very good chair. I was in a meeting the other day. It was nothing to do with the congregation. It was a trustee meeting, actually. And I was one of 4 people who were joining the meeting virtually, and there were 5 people in a room together who were meeting. And at one point, I thought, actually, the 4 of us who are meeting virtually, we may as well not be here, because the chairman was basically looking around at all the 5 people in the room, and they were having a conversation, and each of us had got our electronic hand up, but nobody had noticed that. And it was either a case of sitting there really patiently, but then, as you say, missing the point in time to make you the point that you wanted to make, or being really rude and almost shouting electronically, can somebody just listen to me because I want to make a point? And it was, you need a very good chair.
Well, I think it's interesting as well, isn't it? I've seen different personalities come out on screen that I don't think, if the people had been present in a meeting, would necessarily have gone quite the same way. And I think,
I think, it's interesting because there's no consistency, because I suppose naturally I'm an introvert, and I found certain meetings quite difficult to actually, more difficult than I would have face to face, to actually make my point. But I know of others who are introverts who, because they basically are looking at a computer screen and they're not in a room with terrifying people, have found it very easy to contribute to a meeting, much easier than they would have done if they were in that room.
Yes, I know certainly as an introvert myself, I've certainly found that. But equally, again, it's very easy, isn't it? Because you don't read the room either.
Yeah.
So obviously doing a webinar, it's fine because it takes away the sort of the shyness and the stage fright. But in the meeting, because you can't react to somebody and see how they're feeling, you sometimes go on and press your point perhaps a bit too much, don't you?
I think the other thing with virtual meetings is it's very easy when you're sitting in your computer screen to forget that, well, people can't see. They can't see you, the whole of you, they can't see your surroundings. So, you're sitting there and to all intents and purposes, you're part of a meeting, but you can be monitoring your emails as they're coming in, you can be texting and so on. And I think it's just makes the difference between being 100% part of the meeting, whereas virtually you can be there and to all intents and purposes people think you're there, but actually you're doing something else.
Yes, I think it's been interesting. Certainly I know some of the meetings I've been at as work meetings, you've ended up having conversations by WhatsApp or text with people who are in the meeting. And actually that's probably been more disruptive and less productive than if those discussions were actually part of that meeting.
Yeah, you've got meetings going on within meetings, and with the chat function as well.
Yeah.
You can have individuals communicating with one another, and actually, the rest of the people in the meeting are unaware of that chat that's going on behind the scenes.
Do you think virtual meetings are here to stay, or do you think we'll see people going back to saying, actually, we prefer just to have a physical meeting?
I think they're here to stay. I think they have a part. And I think going forward, if you've got a meeting that's very much a business meeting, you've got a very specific agenda, you know what you want to discuss, then probably a virtual meeting works. But if you've got a meeting where you need that debate, you need the discussion, then I still think face-to-face. And I think, probably hybrid meetings, it's an awful word, isn't it? But hybrid meetings are also here to stay. But I do think they need to be thought through. You need to have the technology, because one of the most annoying things I think about a hybrid meeting, particularly if you're the person joining it virtually, is where the microphone is in the room. And, you can hear certain people, but the microphone is one end of the table and then somebody at the other end of the table talks and you haven't got a clue what they're saying. And it's infuriating when you're trying to follow what's being discussed.
I think one of the things I find interesting is we're all now taking it for granted that we do these things like virtual meetings. And a lot of people forget that some of these things we did because it was an emergency and it was the only way to do it. And people haven't always gone back and thought about the implications or checked whether you can actually do it.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, of course, one of the big issues with the virtual meeting is where does it actually take place? Now, obviously, during the pandemic, that was solved by a piece of legislation that said a meeting can take place nowhere. It doesn't have to have a place. Obviously, going forward, if people are going to continue to have virtual meetings, they probably need to start thinking about these things, don't they? And do you think there are implications about where this meeting is actually going to take place?
There are certainly implications from a tax point of view, because if you are a charity that is registered in England and Wales, HMRC expects you to at least have at least one meeting a year physically here in England and Wales. And if you're all across the world, there is a question, I presume legally as well, as to where is that meeting, and whether you need at least a couple of people who are going to be physically present or joining the meeting virtually from here, because the last thing you want for tax purposes is to suddenly move an English charity to being an Italian charity or something of that nature.
And do you think, obviously HMRC and the Charity Commission have been relatively flexible about these things because they didn't want to be seen to be the trouble. Do you think actually they're now going to start looking at this more aggressively?
I think they are. I certainly think HMRC are, yeah.
And I think one of the other issues, of course, is around management and oversight. And again, we're obviously having lots of people working from home, and that's one of the new things of a virtual world. But again, if you come back to the trustee role being very much about oversight, one of the things, if you're all together in an office or in a building, is you can see when somebody's come in and put their jacket on the chair and then disappeared for 3 hours and you can do something about it. But obviously that oversight of a virtual remote person working from home is much more difficult.
It is, and I think there are two aspects to that. I think the first thing is that for the past 18 months, a number of internal controls inevitably have slipped because people are not physically present in an office. Now that's fine, and everybody understands why those internal controls have probably not operated for the last 18 months, but there is a need now to pick them up again because those controls are there for a purpose. They're absolutely crucial. I think the other interesting thing of that is obviously as an auditor, we've done a lot of our work remotely for the past 18 months. And we've had a few charities who said to us, well, you've done it remotely for the last 2 years, you can continue to do that, can't you? And when we said, well, actually, we'd prefer to come into the office to actually do the audit, that they've sort of said, well, why? And it is interesting because when you're physically in an office with people, even if you're just sitting at a desk doing your work, you're aware of what's going on, you pick up things, you hear things. And that's important to me as an auditor, but it's also important, I think, to members of staff, to trustees, to members of a congregation, that you pick up those nuances, those odd conversations, the things you overhear are so important to you being able to carry out your role and your job properly.
Yes, I mean, it's similar to that whole concept of working at home for our staff as well, isn't it? Is I worry that they're not picking up on lots of things and developing and observing what's going on. And that's been interesting, I think, for some of the religious orders, is their staff have gone and worked from home, but they've stayed together as a community.
Yes.
And that, again, gives a bit of separation, doesn't it, which is not always helpful.
No.
And do you think that there are good things that have come out of this all working in a totally different virtual remote way? Is there something?
I think there are. I think there are times when if you're working remotely, you're working virtually, it's more efficient. So if you've got a project that you want to work on, it's often helpful to be able to lock yourself away and be able to carry out that work. I think there are advantages in terms of, being able to not get involved in a lot of travel. And one of the things for religious congregations, I think traditionally, particularly charities that have involved generates, you've had a group of trustees who very rarely have actually met together because they've been travelling, they've hardly ever seen one another. And I think what the ability to have a virtual meeting does is probably enable you to do some of that travelling, but also come together and meet, because it is so important, I think, for trustees to have that conversation and to be regularly in touch with one another. And I think the virtual environment allows you to do that.
Do you think there's a danger with the virtual environment that if you are part of an international order, that you'll find that the overseas part of the congregation actually may feel now in the virtual world they're able to have a greater control of what's going on perhaps in England than perhaps they might have done in the past?
That's an interesting point, isn't it? And I suppose, yes, there is that danger. But I think the other side of that is that, particularly if you're in an international congregation and you've got sisters in countries like Asia, in continents like Asia or Africa, if you fast forward 10, 15 years' time, there's a real probability that they're going to be responsible for some of the assets that are here in the UK, and whether there's still a charity here in the UK or whatever. But I think it allows you to have some formation of those sisters and for them to be involved in things that otherwise would be very difficult, because they're all going to be very busy in their own countries carrying out their own mission. They don't have the time to travel so that they can attend trustees meetings or even just sit in on trustees meetings. But if you can do that virtually, there is an element of formation that can take place. They can become more involved in the rather peculiar way at times that we do things in this country.
I think what I've found interesting is appreciating some of the advantages of actually having trustees in this country as opposed to spread out across the world. And I can think, for example, obviously during the height of the pandemic, it was helpful to have people who understood what was going on in England, what the restrictions were, what the lockdown was all about, and things like what was the Charity Commission saying here and how did that change how you worked. But even down to practical things. So, for example, we had one order who was interested in selling a car, and they realised that none of the trustees were in the country, and they wanted somebody who needed to sign a document in this country. And we had to go through a very convoluted process with powers of attorney. But it kind of reinforced the advantages of having some local presence and some local trustees who understood what was going on but were there physically to sign things.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I think it's been good for trustees to also have some time talking to one another, because one way or another, I think over the next 5 years, there are going to be an increasing number of areas that congregations need to think carefully about. And you know, in a later conversation, we might talk about legacy and future mission and things like that. But I think some of those discussions have been able to commence. And I think that's because the people have been here together on the ground.
And I think obviously one of the questions we're always asked is about lay trustees. And I suppose that the last 18 months have been quite interesting, and whether that's accelerated the need for lay trustees or whether actually it's made it clear that the role of a trustee perhaps is so different that we don't need lay trustees.
And particularly, to go back to what we were saying a few moments ago, if you can separate out the role of a trustee from the role of management, I think I would hope that many congregations are just reflecting on the fact that actually they can continue to be trustees. I think the role is probably less onerous than many of them believe, and I think that will be relieved even further by bringing in mission partners to help with the work. I personally still believe that there is a place for an advisory committee or something like that. And I think in a way the virtual meetings has made that easier. I do sense that with many clients, they found it easier to actually, over the last 18 months, just pick up the phone or to say, can we have a Teams meeting, can we have a Zoom meeting, just to discuss this. And I think that role of an advisor, whether it be a professional advisor or whether it be an advisory committee, is something that if I were in the leadership of a congregation, that's where I would be thinking, rather than rushing in to actually saying, well, we're all getting older, we need to bring in some lay people to be trustees. Lay trustees will have to come, but I do think it's something that needs an awful lot of thought. You need to get the right people. You need to get people who understand you and have got the skills, and not necessarily people who want to share your way of life or something of that nature.
I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because that terminology of mission partners was relatively new to me, but it's something I'm hearing a lot more about.
Yeah.
And it's always seemed that there has been this sort of fear of lay trustees. And I think people had never fully understood that that didn't really have to mean it necessarily was a lay person or person who didn't share your values. But I think the whole mission partner thing is very interesting, isn't it? Because it's about people who understand and appreciate your mission and want to go forward in partnership with you, but don't have to be part of or living your way of life. And I think finding those right people is probably the way forward. And I think, again, one of the issues, isn't it, is that we all have this concept of people like me, and we go out and find people who are very like us when we recruit for a job or something. And I think, again, there's been this tendency to think if we have a lay trustee or a mission partner, it's got to be someone who is very like us and very in line with what we do. And I've started to think, actually, you want the person with the right skills, who has got the open mind to actually understand and want to share your values, as opposed to saying we've got to have the person who understands our values but doesn't necessarily have the skills.
Totally agree, and I think those skills are absolutely paramount. And I think in terms of somebody who shares your values, yes, you want somebody who understands them, but we all occasionally need to be challenged. And I think that's what you need. You need somebody who's not always going to agree with you, but somebody who has the confidence to say, well, just because we've always done it this way, it doesn't have to always happen like that. Let's try this. Or to just say, well, why do you do that? And we all need that occasionally. And I think you only get that if you bring in people who are slightly different personality types, people who've had different experiences to yourself. And, you know, I think in a way that's the best of both worlds, because congregations have got so many skills themselves in terms of their mission, their work. It's the skills such as the sort of professional skills, the accountancy, the legal side, the property side that they need. But people who've got those will also have applied them in different circumstances and be able to bring in new ideas and different ways of doing things. And to benefit from that has to be a good thing.
Well, I think it feeds back, doesn't it, to what we were saying earlier, that obviously when you think of lay trustees, that starts to make you think about handing over and handing on to other people, whereas mission partners working with you in partnership is back to that helping hand type approach.
And that's crucially important, because one of the things I've always felt really strongly about is if I were a trustee of a religious congregation, I would want to be in control of my own destiny for as long as possible. And I think just accepting the fact that the role of a trustee is that strategic direction, where we want to go. Having that, but having mission partners who can advise you on how to get there, but not actually telling you what to do, is crucially important.
Yes. So I think that's been a really useful conversation. I think that the takeaways for me is that clearly looking back and looking to the future, the role of a trustee is something that could be very much more clearly defined, and within the religious order context can start to adapt and evolve. And I think we've also learned that during the last 18 months, there are a lot of advantages of technology, lots of advantages of working in different ways, but also the drawbacks of not having the physical presence and the people there and the people on the ground. And actually going forward, we need to think how we combine the best of both worlds. And then in addition, clearly it's that role of bringing in mission partners and thinking about how people can work alongside a religious order and alongside the trustees in that helping hand capacity without it having to be a complete handover and a loss of control of their own destiny. And I think how they evolve and take that forward into the future is going to be really important.
I think so, and I think for the next few years the role of trustee in a religious congregation is going to be extremely important. I think there are some key decisions and some key areas that need to be thought about, not least, we're all getting older. How long are they going to continue to be members in this country? What's our mission going to be looking like for the next 10, 15 years? And I suppose ultimately what's going to happen when there are no members in this country? There are different ways in which that can be addressed. The charity itself can continue, but I think that needs to be thought about. What happens to the assets? What happens to the resources? And I think before you get to that ultimate decision, there are going to be some key decisions to be made about financing, key decisions about what we do with our money, what property we need, where those properties should be, how we care for our own members, whether we do it in community, whether we do it through care homes, whether those care homes are run by ourselves or by third parties. So I think there is so much for religious congregation trustees to think about in the next few years. And that's why I think they need to separate out that thought process, that decision making from the day-to-day work, and that, as we've said, can be done by mission partners and having people that you can trust, that you can work with. But I think the other thing that needs to be said is it's very easy to think we're all getting older, and it's depressing. It's an end game that we're planning for. It needn't be like that. There are huge opportunities and different ways in which the legacy of the congregation can go forward, but it needs to be thought about. And I absolutely agree, Tim. I think we need to just, in our next conversation, just be thinking about some of those exciting opportunities that members need to be talking about.
The next developmental phase of religious order charities.
Exactly.